History is usually written by the victors, the men standing in the sun, but the most dangerous chapters of human history are written in the shadows. Bitegos. To understand the nightmare we are about to enter, you must first feel the temperature of Russia in the 1860s. It wasn't just cold, it was suffocating. Imagine a vast, frozen empire paralyzed by fear. Under the iron grip of the Tsar the Third Section, the imperial secret police was everywhere. They had eyes in every tavern, ears in every church, and whispers in every university. A wrong word, a forbidden book, or even a suspicious look could send a man to the freezing mines of Siberia forever. The gap between the gilded palaces of St. Petersburg and the starving, mud-soaked peasants was an abyss that no bridge could span. In this frozen landscape, a new generation was boiling over with rage. They were young, educated, and desperate. They looked at their father's generation and saw only failure. They rejected the church, the state, and the family. They called themselves nihilists. They wanted to burn the old world down, believing that only from the ashes could something pure grow. But rage, no matter how hot, is useless without a weapon. They had the anger, but they lacked the direction. They were a powder keg waiting for a match. What they wanted was a monster. Enter Sergei Nechayev. Look at him. He doesn't look like a warlord. He looks like a nobody from Ivan. He wears a tattered coat that smells of cheap tobacco. His hands are rough, stained with ink. He blends perfectly into the gray crowd of Moscow. But inside that coat, he carries a weapon far more lethal than a pistol or a bomb. It is a manuscript. A few crumpled sheets of paper that would rewrite the code of human morality. He called it the Catechism of a Revolutionary. This document wasn't just a pamphlet. It was the blueprint of terror for the modern age. It is perhaps the coldest text ever written by a human hand. Let's open it and look at the darkness inside. The first paragraph hits you like a physical blow. The revolutionary is a doomed man. He has no personal interests, no business, no emotions, no attachments, no property, and no name. Nechayev wasn't just asking for loyalty. He was demanding the total erasure of the self. This is a psychological mechanism known as deindividuation, taken to a fanatical extreme. He argued that to change the world, you must first stop being human. You must become a tool. A blade does not love. A blade does not pity. A blade only cuts. He went further. In section 6, he wrote, tyrannical toward himself, he must be tyrannical toward others. All the tender, softening sentiments of kinship, friendship, love, gratitude, and even honor must be stifled in him. Think about that. Think about that. He is telling young men that honor is a weakness. He categorized people not as humans, but as capital resources to be spent. He created lists. People to be killed immediately, people to be blackmailed, and people to be used until they were destroyed. It was a cold mathematical approach to human relationships. For the angry young students of Russia, lost in a world without purpose, this brutality was strangely seductive. It offered them a holy mission. It told them, your life doesn't matter. Only the cause matters. It was a license to commit any crime, tell any lie, betray any loved one, as long as it served the revolution. But a manifesto needs a legend to carry it. Nechayev knew that a poor teacher's son wouldn't command respect from the elite intellectuals. So, he decided to invent a new reality. He traveled to Geneva, Switzerland, the sanctuary for Russian exiles. There, he set his sights on a target. Mikhail Bakunin was a Jayanta, legendary revolutionary, a man who had fought on barricades across Europe. He was the father of anarchism, but by 1869, he was an old lion, toothless, tired, living in poverty, and desperate for a legacy. Nechayev, a 22-year-old wolf, approached him. He didn't ask for help. He played a masterstroke of manipulation. He knew the old man craved action. So Nechayev spun a lie, so bold, it borders on insanity. He told Bakunin that he had just escaped from the Peter and Paul fortress. You have to understand the weight of this lie. The fortress was a stone coffin built on an island in the Neva River, surrounded by freezing waters and thick granite walls. It was the Tsar's personal dungeon. Abandon hope, all the who enter here. No one escaped the fortress. It was physically impossible. But Nechayev looked the old revolutionary in the eye and described the damp walls, the guards he tricked, the daring dash for freedom. He spoke with such gritty detail, with such cold confidence, that Bakunin believed him. The old man was blinded by admiration. He saw in Nechayev the energy he himself had lost. He saw a successor. Nechayev played the role of the humble disciple perfectly. while secretly mocking the old man's naivety in his private letters. Bakunin gave Nechayev his blessing. Ekatedim de boy, our tiger cub. This endorsement was the golden ticket Nechayev needed. But Nechayev wanted more than a blessing. He wanted authority. Together, they created a phantom organization, the World Revolutionary Alliance. It sounded massive. It sounded unstoppable. In reality, it was two men in a Swiss apartment. But to the outside world, it was a terrifying shadow government. Nechayev drafted official documents for himself. He designed a silestam featuring a crude, violent image of an axe. Not a pen, not a star, but an axe. The symbol of peasant violence, of chopping down the old forest. When he held that paper, stamped with the axe, he wasn't Sergei Nechayev anymore. He was representative number 2771 of the Alliance. Armed with these lies, the fake escape, the fake organization, and the stolen reputation of Sergei Nechayev, bought a ticket back to Moscow. He was returning to the student movement, but he wasn't coming to liberate them. He was coming to hunt. He carried the catechism in his pocket, like a hunting license. He knew exactly what he was looking for. Young, naive idealists who were willing to die for a cause they didn't understand. He wasn't there to save them. He was coming to sacrifice them. The ghost had arrived in Moscow, and he was hungry. Moscow, late 1869. The winter came early to the Petrovskaya Agricultural Academy. The ponds in the park were freezing over, turning into dark, unblinking eyes. The dormitories were filled with the acrid smoke of cheap tobacco and dangerous ideas. This place was unique. It was an island of liberalism in a sea of czarist autocracy. The students here were intelligent, hungry, and deeply resentful. They felt the weight of a dying empire on their shoulders, but they had nowhere to channel their rage. They were a weapon, waiting for a trigger. And walking among these angry young men was a ghost in a heavy coat. Sergei Nechayev. He didn't storm the gates like a conqueror. He seeped in like a poisonous fog. He carried himself with the quiet, terrifying confidence of a man who knows secrets that could topple the Tsar. When he spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He lowered it, forcing you to lean in, drawing you into his orbit. He began to build his machine, Narodnaya Rasprava, the people's reprisal. But this was not a political party. It was a cult designed with the architecture of a prison. Nechayev knew that to control men, you must first isolate them. He introduced a structural concept that would become the gold standard for espionage cells for the next century. The Circle of Five. Think of a submarine with watertight compartments. If one room floods, the water cannot spread to the others. Nechayev organizes men into strictly isolated cells of 5. You sat in a room with 4 comrades. You knew their faces. You knew their secrets. But you did not know who was in the room next door. You didn't know if there were 10 circles or 10,000. You were blind. The only person who held the blueprint of the entire ship, the only bridge between these isolated islands of information, was Nechayev himself. This was a masterclass in information control. By restricting the flow of data, he created a state of total dependency. The members had to rely entirely on Nechayev for their reality. He became their eyes, their ears, and their conscience. To cement his control, Nechayev utilized a psychological weapon known as the specter of authority. He constantly spoke of the committee, a mysterious, all-powerful, central committee based in Geneva. Whenever he gave an order, no matter how absurd or immoral, he never claimed it was his own. He would say, "The committee demands this test of loyalty. The committee is watching your progress. The committee does not forgive hesitation." By inventing this invisible power, he removed himself from the equation of accountability. If a student questioned an order, Nechayev would simply shrug. He made them afraid of a ghost. But fear was not enough. He needed insurance. He instituted a ritual of compromise. To join the inner circle, every member had to prove their loyalty by burning their bridges. Nechayev forced them to steal private documents from their families. He made them write confessions, admitting to revolutionary thoughts or crimes they hadn't even committed yet. He was gathering the chains to bind them. He held their reputations, their futures, and their freedom in a locked box. If anyone tried to leave, Nechayev could destroy them with a single letter to the police. They were no longer volunteers. They were hostages. Now, look at the men inside the room. Besides Nechayev, there were 4 others. To understand the tragedy that followed, we must see them not as faceless goons, but as real people. There was Pyotr Uspensky, a man who craved order and hierarchy. There was Alexei Kuznetsov, a merchant's son, terrified of his own shadow. There was Nechayev, desperate to belong. And most tragically, there was Ivan Pryzhov, an older man, a once respected writer now broken by poverty and alcohol. These were not born killers. They were broken souls looking for a savior. But instead of salvation, they found Nechayev. They sat with their heads bowed, afraid to make eye contact, afraid that if they spoke, they would be the next victim of his mental dominance. They had surrendered their will to the leader. But one man still dared to think. His name was Ivan Ivanov. Ivanov was different. He was 23 years old, popular, energetic, and sharp. He had joined the organization with a fire in his heart, hoping to help the starving peasants. He was an ideal. But Ivanov had a fatal flaw in Nechayev's eyes. He still had a conscience. Ivanov started to watch Nechayev closely. He saw the inconsistencies. He noticed that the committee never wrote letters. Only Nechayev spoke for them. He saw how Nechayev treated people like disposable tools. The tension simmered for weeks. It reached a breaking point in November 1869. The setting was a cramped, dimly lit student apartment, smelling of stale tea and anxiety. Nechayev had arrived with a new order from the committee. He ordered the students to paste revolutionary manifestos on the walls of the student dining hall. It was a mission of self-destruction. The dining hall was crawling with monitors. Anyone caught would be expelled and arrested. Ivanov stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the wooden floor echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. The other four, Ouspensky, Kuznetsov, Prisov, and Nikolaev, lynched, shrinking into their collars, trying to make themselves invisible in the dim light. "I refuse," Ivanov said. His voice was trembling, but his eyes were clear. "This is madness. You are asking us to throw our lives away for nothing." Nechayev looked at him coldly. "The committee does not explain itself to soldiers. It demands obedience." "Then I'm done," Ivanov shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "I joined to save the people, not to worship a ghost. I'm not dying for your lies. I'm out." Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. The four accomplices looked at Ivanov with horror, not because he was wrong, but because he was saying what they were too cowardly to say. Then, slowly, they turned their terrified eyes to Nechayev, waiting for the punishment. Nechayev didn't scream. He didn't pound the table. He just stared at Ivanov. In that silence, a terrifying calculation was running through his mind. Nechayev realized he had a problem. Ivanov wasn't just a dissenter. He was a loose thread. If Ivanov walked out that door alive, he would start talking. He would expose the fact that the committee was a fiction. The whole house of cards would collapse. Ivanov stormed out into the cold night, his breath misting in the air, thinking he had reclaimed his freedom. He believed he was quitting a political club. He didn't realize he had just sealed his fate. Nechayev turned to the remaining four students. The candlelight flickered on his face, casting long shadows that made him look less like a man and more like a judge. He leaned in close, his voice a poisonous whisper. "Did you see that? Did you see how we panicked?" The students shook their heads, confused and frightened. They were desperate for guidance. "The committee has received intelligence," Nechayev lied smoothly, his eyes locking onto theirs. "Ivanov is not just leaving. He is a spy. He has been working for the secret police all along. He provoked us tonight to gather evidence. He is going to turn us all in." The room erupted in panic, and panic is easy to steer. Nechayev triggered the US versus them survival instinct. "We cannot let him destroy us," Nechayev said, extinguishing the candle, plunging the room into darkness. "We must act, all of us, together, to save the revolution. The traitor must be silenced." The trap was shut. Nechayev had signed the warrant. The execution was set. November 21st, 1869. The sun had set hours ago, plunging Moscow into a freezing darkness. The grounds of the Petrovskaya Agricultural Academy were silent, buried under a thick layer of frost. The only sound was the crunch of boots on snow and the howling of the wind through the birch trees. Nechayev gathered his four disciples, Ouspensky, Kuznetsov, Nikolaev, and the old writer, Prisov. They met in the shadows, away from the dormitories, their breath misted in the cold air. But it wasn't just the cold that made them shiver. It was the crushing weight of what they were about to do. Nechayev looked at them. He saw their fear. He knew that if he gave them a moment to think, to breathe, they would run. So he kept the pressure high. He fed them one last lie to push them over the edge. He did not say, "We are going to murder our friend." He said, "We are going to the grotto to retrieve the printing press that the spy Ivanov has stolen. We are going to eliminate the traitor." He framed it as a mission of justice, not a crime. They marched towards the park. The destination was the grotto. It was an artificial cave, a mock ruin built for romantic summer strolls. But tonight, in the dead of winter, it looked like the mouth of a tomb. The black gaping hole waited for them. Nechayev ordered his men to hide inside the shadows of the cave. "Wait for him," Nechayev whispered, his eyes gleaming in the dark. "When he arrives, do not hesitate. The future of the revolution depends on your strength tonight." He waited. The silence in the cave was heavy, suffocating. Inside that darkness, fear smelled like sweat and stale alcohol. Prigozhin, the old writer, was trembling violently. Without his usual vodka to numb the nerves, his mind was a fog of regret. Ouspensky stood rigid, trying to harden his heart, repeating Nechayev's lies like a prayer to keep his hands from shaking. Kuznetsov and Nikolaev were just terrified children, wishing they were back in their warm beds, wishing they had never met Sergei Nechayev. But they couldn't leave. Nechayev stood at the entrance, a sentinel blocking their retreat. He had cut off their escape routes, both physical and mental. Then, footsteps. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Ivanov arrived. He was alone. He walked with a purpose, believing he was there to meet his comrades, to discuss the printing press. He had no idea that he was walking into a deadly trap. He stepped into the darkness of the grotto. Nechayev called out, "Are you there?" The trap sprung. Nechayev didn't wait for his hesitant followers. He lunged first. This was crucial. In any mob violence, the leader must break the seal. He grabbed Ivanov, trying to pin him down. But real violence is not like the opera. It is messy, it is loud, it is desperate. Ivanov was strong. He realized instantly that this was not a debate, a goodbye. He screamed a raw, terrifying sound that echoed off the stone walls of the cave. "What are you doing? Let me go." Nechayev struggled to hold him. He turned to his frozen disciples, his face twisted in a blind fury. "Don't just stand there," he screamed. "Help me. Hold him. If he escapes, he will denounce us all. We will all hang." This was the trigger. Nechayev knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't asking for help. He was forcing them to become If they stood still, they were witnesses to a crime, and Nechayev would destroy them. If they jumped in, they became partners, and Nechayev would protect them. Fear is a powerful motivator. The four accomplices broke from their paralysis. They jumped on Ivan. Ouspensky grabbed his arms. Prigozhin and the others held his legs. They pinned him to the cold, hard ground. In that moment, the crime shifted. It was no longer Nechayev's act. It was their act. When 5 pairs of hands are holding a victim down, no single person feels the full weight of the sin. The guilt is diluted, spread thin across the group, until it becomes bearable. They ceased to be individuals. They became a single, many-armed organism of destruction. Ivanov, pinned by his own friends, looked up at them. One can only imagine the betrayal he felt in those final seconds. He wasn't being attacked by strangers. He was being eliminated by the very people he wanted to save. Nechayev, panting heavily, pulled out a revolver, a weapon he had likely never fired in anger. He aimed it at Ivanov's head. He wanted a quick resolution. He pulled the trigger. Click. The gun jammed. It was a nightmare of incompetence. The silence that followed that click was deafening. It gave the victim one last moment of hope, and the attackers one last moment to realize the madness of their actions. But Nechayev didn't stop. He didn't panic. With a cold, mechanical determination, he wrestled with the gun. He cleared the jam. He didn't look at Ivanov as a human being. He looked at him as an obstacle. He pressed the barrel against Ivanov's skull again. The gun roared. The sound shattered the silence of the park. Ivanov collapsed. The struggle was over. The silence rushed back into the cave, heavier than before. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the smell of fear. Nechayev stood over the body. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at his 4 accomplices. They were shaking. Kuznetsov was sobbing quietly. Prigozhin looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. They were on the verge of a breakdown. Nechayev knew he had to act fast. He had to stabilize the group. He didn't offer them comfort. He offered them clarity. "Now," he said, his voice cutting through the dark, "we are bound by blood." This was his final trap. By staining their hands with the same crime, he locked the door to their exit forever. They could never leave him now. They could never go to the police. He held their lives in his hands. They were no longer students. They were shadows. "Get rid of him," Nechayev ordered. They dragged the heavy, limp body of their friend through the snow to a nearby pond. It was a gruesome, exhausting task. The body felt heavier with every step. The snow was slippery. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a police whistle. They wrapped him in his own heavy coat and filled the pockets with bricks they had brought from a nearby construction site. They found a hole in the ice. With one final, collective heave, they pushed Ivan Ivanov into the freezing black water. Dark water erupted. As the body hit the surface, the ripples faded. The surface began to freeze over again. Nechayev looked at the dark water. He believed he had won. He believed he had created the perfect Sela unit forged in fire, unbreakable. He had eliminated a threat and secured the absolute loyalty of his men. The walk back to the dormitories was a funeral procession of the living. Nechayev walked in front, head high, energized by the violence. Behind him, Uspensky, Kuznetsov, Nechayev, and Prigozhin stumbled like sleepwalkers. They were physically exhausted, but mentally, they were shattered. That night, a terrifying contrast played out in the dormitories. Nechayev, the architect of the nightmare, fell asleep almost instantly, resting with the clear conscience of a fanatic. Meanwhile, his four accomplices lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind, replaying the sound of the gunshot over and over in their heads. They realized too late that the person they had truly killed in that cave was themselves. But in his arrogance, the genius manipulator made a simple, human mistake. He was so focused on the psychology of control that he forgot the physics of the evidence. In the chaos of the struggle, Ivanov's hat had fallen off and was left lying on the snowy bank. And worse, Nechayev had underestimated the buoyancy of a human body in a thick winter coat. The bricks were not heavy enough. The perfect crime was not buried. It was waiting to float to the surface. November 25th, 1869. 4 days after the incident, a peasant walking through the park noticed something strange near the grotto. It wasn't a log, and it wasn't a rock. It was a dark shape bobbing in the freezing water of the pond. The perfect crime had failed due to simple physics. The bricks were too light. The gases of decomposition had done their work. Ivan Ivanov had returned from the depths to accuse his killers. When the police pulled the body out, the horror was undeniable. They checked the pockets of the waterlogged coat and found identity papers. The victim was Ivan Ivanov, a student at the academy. The police didn't need Sherlock Holmes to solve this. They simply looked at Ivanov's known associates. Their first stop was the apartment of P8. When the third section, the SARS feared secret police kicked down Uspensky's door, they found more than just a frightened student. They found Nechayev's stupidity. In his arrogance, Nechayev had left behind a trove of documents at Uspensky's home, membership lists, codes, and violent plans. He had kept receipts of his own crimes. The investigation turned into a manhunt. The police descended on the Circle of Five like a pack of wolves. And this is where Nechayev's psychological masterpiece crumbled. He had built his organization on fear. He believed that the blood bond, the shared guilt of the crime, would keep his disciples silent forever. He was wrong. The unbreakable cell turned out to be made of glass. When faced with the threat of hard labor in Siberia, the group didn't just break, they shattered. One by one, from the terrified merchant's son to the old alcoholic writer, they fought to be the first to sell Nechayev out. They confessed everything: the cave, the jammed gun, the lies about the committee, and the name of the puppet master, Sergei Nechayev. But where was the master? While his friends were being dragged away in chains, Nechayev was already gone. The man who preached about dying for the cause, the man who demanded absolute loyalty, had quietly packed his bags and fled to Switzerland the moment the body was found. He left his followers to suffer alone. It was the ultimate act of hypocrisy. The hero was a coward. In July 1871, the Russian government staged a massive trial. The trial of the Nechayevetsi. 87 people were dragged before the court. It was a spectacle. The Tsar wanted to use this trial as propaganda. He wanted to show the public the face of the new radicals, to prove that these nihilists were not saviors, but cold-blooded killers. To ensure the public understood the horror, the prosecutors did something unprecedented. They read Nechayev's secret manifesto, the Catechism of a Revolutionary, out loud in the courtroom. They printed it in the official government newspaper. They thought the public would be disgusted by lines like "the revolutionary knows only the science of destruction." But the government made a fatal miscalculation. Instead of disgust, the public felt a strange fascination. Young radicals across Russia read the Catechism and didn't see a warning. They saw a manual. They saw a blueprint for power. Nechayev's ideas, meant to be buried, were now broadcast to the entire nation. The trial didn't kill the virus, it spread it. Meanwhile, Nechayev was living in Zurich, Switzerland. He was still trying to play the role of the mysterious leader, but his time was running out. The Russian Empire had a long memory. In 1872, acting on a tip-off, the Swiss police arrested him and handed him over to Russia. And here, history delivers its most poetic justice. Nechayev was not sent to Siberia. He was sent to St. Petersburg. He was thrown into the very place he had lied about escaping from, the Peter and Paul fortress. He was locked in the Alexeyevsky Rabelin, a prison within the prison, a damp, stone tomb designed to break the strongest spirits. A was listed as prisoner number 5 A ade noname. Just as his catechism demanded, he had become a doomed man. In the literal sense, most men would have gone mad in the silence. But Sergei Nechayev was not like other men. Even in chains, even in the dark, his manipulative genius was still alive. He began to work on the guards. This is perhaps the most terrifying part of his story. He didn't have money to bribe them. He didn't have weapons to threaten them. He only had his voice. Day by day, whisper by whisper, he began to groom the simple peasant soldiers guarding his cell. He played on their poverty. He played on their resentment of their officers. He became their priest, their teacher, and their commander. Incredibly, it worked. The soldiers fell under his spell. They began to smuggle letters out for him. They brought him extra food. They even discussed a plan to help him escape and assassinate the Tsar. From the bottom of a dungeon, Nechayev was secretly running a new radical cell made up of his own jailers. It was a final, terrifying display of his power. He was a spider who could spin a web even in a vacuum, but his body could not keep up with his mind. The damp conditions of the fortress eventually claimed him. He developed dropsy and scurvy. On November 21st, 1882, exactly 13 years to the day after the crime at the grotto, Sergei Nechayev died in his cell. He was 35 years old. He died alone, unrepentant, still believing he was the savior of the world. But the story does not end with his death. The famous author, Fyodor Dostoevsky, was so terrified by the Nechayev case that he wrote his masterpiece, Demons, as a desperate scream to the world. He didn't create a villain. He simply described Nietzsche. He wanted to show us, look at the monsters we are creating when we separate intelligence from morality. Nechayev's legacy is written in blood. He was the father of political Machiavellianism. Decades later, a young revolutionary named Vladimir Lenin didn't just read Nechayev. He weaponized him. Lenin admired Nechayev's organizational genius. The ruthlessness of the Bolshevik party structure was not an accident. It was Nechayev's catechism brought to life on a national scale. So, what is the lesson of Sergei Nechayev? It is a warning about the dark side of leadership. Nechayev showed us that a man with no army, no money, and no name can still destroy the world if he understands the cracks in the human psyche. He showed us how his ally ideals can be twisted into crimes. He showed us that the most dangerous prison is not built of stone, but of lies. Ivan Ivanov lies at the bottom of a frozen pond, a victim of his own conscience. Sergei Nechayev lies in an unmarked grave, a victim of his own hubris. But the catechism remains. It sits on the dark shelves of history, waiting for the next angry young man to pick it up, blow off the dust, and whisper, "I know how to save the world." And that is the true horror story.